Hello and welcome everyone for today's webinar. My name is Stefan Gebele and today I'd like to show you how easily it is to exchange data between Siemens S7 1500 and the IBM Watson IoT platform.
The session today is separated in two parts. We will start with the theoretical part where I'm going to explain what MQTT is and how it works. In Chapter 3 I will give you a brief overview about the dataFEED OPC suite, the software which we are using today to send data to the IBM Watson IoT platform. This is followed by the practical part, the actual live demo.
So what is MQTT? MQTT is short for message queuing telemetry transport, and it's an application protocol. So maybe you have heard of other protocols like OPC UA or HTTP. MQTT is simply another way of communication. And it's lightweight. That means that your devices which speak MQTT don't need much computing power, and therefore it's ideal for IoT devices like small sensors, cars, or simply every kind of devices. It has a publisher-subscriber architecture. I will explain what that means in the next slide. And it's using TCP as the transport protocol. A few words to security. Authentication can be done via username and password. You can also use certificates, and of course you can also encrypt your data by using a SSL connection. So how does MQTT work? So in the middle you can see there's a broker, which is some kind of a distributor or dispatcher. On the left-hand side you can see the publisher, which generates and sends the data to the broker. On the right-hand side there are the subscribers, which are interested in messages, which are interested in the data. So in that case the consumer or the subscriber will make a subscription of the topic he's interested in. Maybe it's only one or all the topics, and then he receives the data as soon as they are available on the broker. Important to mention is, in today's session, the dataFEED OPC suite represents the publisher, and the broker and subscriber are inside the cloud, inside the IBM cloud. So, Chapter 3, the dataFEED OPC suite. That's a software solution from Softing. You can install it on your computer or on your server. And what it basically does is it collects data from different data sources, like an OPC UA server. We can also connect to different PLCs, like today we are using Siemens, but it's also possible to connect to a Rockwell, Mitsubishi PLC. Everything is possible. Could also grab data from a classic server or a SQL database. And once we have done that, we can decide to which destination we want to send the data or to provide the data. So we can do a protocol conversion between OPC UA and OPC Classic. We can also say that we want to write data into a SQL database from a Modbus PLC like Schneider, Rockwell, or we can send it to MindSphere like we are doing in one of our next webinars. So that's basically what the dataFEED suite does. In today's session we want to send data from a S7 1500 to the IBM Watson IoT platform. This is done via the dataFEED OPC suite. The first step is that we establish a connection between the S7 and the dataFEED OPC suite. The second step is that we establish a connection between the suite and the cloud, the IBM Watson IoT platform. And the last step, the third step, is that we have to do a so-called mapping, because we have to decide which data we want to send. Okay, this is already the end of the theoretical part. So I want to start now with the practical part. So, as already mentioned, what I have to do first, I have to start the dataFEED OPC suite. And I have to select Siemens as a data source. As already described, I have here a bunch of possibilities where I can collect data from. Morpus, Rockwell, I can also read from a database, from an OPC Classic server, but in today's session I want to establish a connection between dataFEED OPC suite and the Siemens. So I add a new data source. By clicking that button, I can give them a new name, let's say S7-1500, and now I have to choose which protocol I'm using. So in that case, because it's a S7-1500, I'm using the S7-2 protocol, which is very convenient because it allows me browsing, and I also have access to the optimized data blocks. So I click Next. Now I have to specify the IP address of my PLC. I do a connection test, and great, connection test is successful. So now I can here set some filters, but it's not necessary in that case. So I click Next, and now you see I can browse all the variables which are available inside the PLC. I don't have to change the program, I don't have to touch anything on the PLC side. I can browse all the data, I don't have to do a simple import. That makes it so convenient. And I have already mentioned it, I have access to the optimized data blocks. So the first step, establishing connection to the Siemens S7-1500, is done. I will proceed with the next step, the actual connection to the cloud. So for that, I have to log into the IBM Watson IoT platform. Okay. So this is my page. Hang on a second. Okay. So what I do now is I want to create a device. So I have already created here two, but I want to start from scratch, and that's why I start with clicking that button here on the very top, Add New Device. So that device is later representing my digital device. Could be a temperature sensor, or in my case, it's the digital representation of a PLC, and my device ID is Siemens. I can specify that to two strings as I want. I can give here any name, what suits you. Okay, I press Next. Here I can add some additional data, some metadata, but it's optional, so I don't have to use it. I can use it, but it's not necessary. So I can proceed here. This is very important. So IBM provides me two opportunities to generate the token, to generate the password. The first is auto-generated, or I can also use a self-provided authentication token, which means that I can specify the password myself. I leave it as it is, auto-generated, so the password is generated by the IBM Cloud, which we will see in the following steps. So this is the summary. I can check what I've typed in. Security token to be generated, that's all good, so I press Finish. These are my credentials which I need to establish a connection, and the best thing is that I copy all this and paste it into a file. I've already provided here one. So organization ID is, I will show you in the organization ID can be found here. This is given from the IBM cloud, and my organization ID is, is that part. Device ID is PLC, device ID is Siemens, authentication method is use token authentication, and my token, which is representing my password, is that strange string here. So I've everything done in the cloud, so now I have to configure the dataFEED OPC suite. So the first step was to establish a connection between the Siemens. I've done that in the data source section, and now I go to data destination, and I could provide the data via OPC UA, or I can write data in the NoSQL database. But today I want to send data to the MQTT broker, so I'm choosing that as the data destination. I press the add button. I can give it a fancy name, let's say MQTT IBM. And now I have to specify the client ID. And the client ID is given from the IBM, and in the documentation it says that the client ID must be in that format, so it must be a D : organization ID : device type : device ID. Important here to mention is that this format is not given by Softing, it is simply described in the documentation of IBM. So it says D : organization ID, which can be found here, : device type, : and last is my device ID. So I copy that and paste it, and I can proceed with the next step. I'm using an encrypted way to communication via SSL, and the URI is also specified in the documentation, and it's organization ID .messaging.internetofthings.ibmcloud.com. The port which I'm using is the 8883. It's the standard port for SSL via MQTT. So I just have to take this one, and I can copy the rest because that is always the same. It's just make a different from the organization ID. So I copy that again and paste it into the URI field. Okay, looks good. Now I have to set the authentication settings. We are doing that via username and password. The username is always the same. It's always use token authentication. And the password is that token which was generated by the IBM cloud. Okay, this is all good. I try to connect. Okay, it says connection test successful. I proceed with the next step. Now I have to define the so-called topics. These are representing later my messages. And again, IBM says the topic structure must be hierarchical, and it must start always with IoT -2, and followed by another node called IoT. So we need always these two nodes. It's given from the IBM cloud. And the next tag, the next node, I can specify myself. So in my case, it's temperature. Then we have to add another node, which is representing the format. And the last one is in that format, it's the publishing format, it's Bluemix JSON. and the name is JSON because it's describing the publishing format. I can also use XML or CSV, but in my case I send the data in the JSON format, so the format is JSON. That's why I typed that in. So maybe this looks strange to you, but it's simply given by the IBM Cloud that we always need to follow that hierarchical structure. These two at the beginning, the IoT -2 and the event, the EVT, is fixed, so you can't change that. What you can change is that node, the temperature, and of course your format is also depends on what format you are sending. So proceed, I can enable here last will, which means I send a message at the beginning. What should happen if the client, if the suite disconnects ungracefully, and then the IBM Bluemix Cloud will forward a message to the underlying subscribers. But I don't need that because it's just a demo. Okay, store and forward. I think that is clear what is meant by this. I leave it as it is. Okay, so the second step, establish the connection between dataFEED OPC Suite and the IBM Cloud Platform is done. I just have to do the last step. This is the actual mapping. So I haven't decided yet what exact messages I want to send. And this is done by the data processing section, which is in the middle between data source and data destination. So I click on the exchange button, I activate the exchange option, and now I want to send data from my Siemens S7 1500, let's say room temperature, and I want to map this onto the MQTT protocol to that JSON. So I press here in the middle of the button, and now I've done that matching. I can specify a trigger type. This is an item trigger, which means if the quality or the value change, the trigger is fired. I can also set a timer trigger or a variable trigger. I'm using a timer trigger, let's say every second I want to send data. So I start from a new one, or let's say 2 seconds, every 2 seconds. Interval timer, now I can specify how often, let's say every 2000 milliseconds, and finish. Okay, so that is everything what I need to do in the dataFEED suite. Now I start the suite and I should receive data now in the IBM Cloud. So let's go back to the IBM Cloud, click on devices here, and I already see that my device is connected. I can click on it, and on the recent events the data should arrive. And as you can see, here I can heat up now the temperature sensor, and the value should increase. Says can also go to state, which is representing the state, or device information. You can see again what you've typed in. Okay, so now I go back to the presentation. This is actually the end of the practical part. So are there any questions left? You can see that sound is gone. Okay, no questions. Additionally, you can send me an email with your questions if you have anything what I haven't answered. So on this point, I'd like to say thank you for your attention and for your time. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Keep care and goodbye.